We live in a society that worships technology. Jet engines, iPads, high-speed rail. And technology has in some ways made geography less visible. It's defeated it. Think about it. We fly over tall mountains. We text over wide seas. We drive through punishing deserts. And technology might be less visible to us, but it's by no means less relevant, especially to world politics. Think about it. Dictators die, governments fall, but mountains, oceans, deserts, these remain, and they continue to influence the world in important and reliable ways. I work as a defense analyst. I spend a lot of time looking at maps. Maps of where to move things, maps of where to put things, maps of oil flows, trade flows, gas flows. Geography is such an important part of the way that I look at the world. And I'm hoping that by the end of this talk, it becomes an important part of the way that you view the world as well. So TED is often about the future. And I do want to take us to the future of Asia. But I'm going to do it by taking a detour through the past. Specifically, I'm going to talk about three things. First, a question. Why are China and India so big? Why do they have so many people? It's a question we rarely ask. We just take it for granted that they're populous. Second, these two countries used to be rich once. They're not anymore. What exactly happened? And third, they are getting richer gradually, again and again over time. What's going to happen in the future? So these are the three questions we're going to talk about today. China, India, geography, these three, let's go. The very first question, why are China and India so big? Why do they have so many people? To answer that question, I'm going to tell you a story. Specifically, the story of a number. This number, 2.6 billion. That's the number of people today who live in China and in India. And it's a pretty big number. And if I were to take the 10 biggest countries by population on the planet and put them in order of 1 through 10 on a chart, like this chart, you'd see that China and India, unsurprisingly, are number 1 and 2. Now, you knew that. But what might surprise you is number 3, the United States. Because the gap between the first two and the US is vast. It's huge. And it's, in fact, so big that you could fit 1, 2, 3, 4 US populations together, and you still wouldn't even have one Indian population, let alone one Chinese population. That's how concentrated the world's population is in just 2 countries, China and India. And if we want to know exactly how concentrated, I can tell you. The answer is 40%. 4 in 10 human beings alive today live in China or in South Asia. Now, that actually might not terribly surprise you. I mean, you've heard that these are big countries. It kind of makes sense that a lot of people would live there. But what no newspaper article will ever tell you is that this is not a recent phenomenon. This has been true for a very, very long time. And thanks to the careful and meticulous work of demographers and historians, I can tell you, in fact, I can actually show you for exactly how long the world's population has been concentrated in just these 2 countries. Before I do, let me just put it this way. You might say that if you take human history, half of it took place in China and India. Because for 2,000 years, about half of the world's population lived in China and India. That blue bar that towers over the other bars, that is the percentage of the world's population that lives in China and India. The red, the green, the purple, they never come close. Europe, Africa, the Americas, they're just nowhere near for 2,000 years, that blue bar. 50% of the world's population or more lived in China and India for most of world history. What's interesting about this, though, isn't just that blue bar being so tall for so long. It's that, think about that 2,000 years. Because a lot happened in those 2,000 years. Disasters, wars, famines, peace, migrations, plagues. And none of those things changed this fundamental demographic fact. The world's people live in these 2 places. So that's pretty crazy. And we need to explain it. And I told you I would, so now I'm going to start getting to that explanation. The answer, the reason why this is true, comes down to geography. Now, I've spent a lot of time traveling through China and India. I've seen these very geographic features that I'll be discussing shortly. And in my travels, I love talking to people about their countries in China and in India. These rising powers, fast-growing economies, extremely important countries. And I often ask, who built China? Who built India? Who's responsible for the success of these 2 countries today? And I get varying answers, but usually they come down in about 2 ways. In China, I often hear that Deng Xiaoping, the man on the left, built China. He's responsible for China's economic reforms. I hear that Nehru on the right built India. He's responsible in part for India's independence and subsequent modernization. And these are important people. They made major contributions to their country's future. But they didn't build China and India. No individual built these two countries. This did. This is the Tibetan Plateau. This is 14,000 feet high. This is 1 million square miles. This is home to thousands and thousands of glaciers. This is the largest concentration of fresh water anywhere on the planet. It's called the rooftop of the world, and from that rooftop flows the waters of all the major rivers of China and India. And in those waters, you find rich, rich silt. Those waters wash into the Wei River Valley of China, the birthplace of Chinese civilization, the Indus River Valley and the Gangetic Plain of India, the birthplace of Indian civilization. Is it really such a surprise, though, that the world's largest populations were born in the shadow of the world's tallest mountains? No, it's not a surprise. There's a reason this happened. I'm going to take you through very quickly some of that history. It's a lot of history. So for a very long time, you see, these waters came down into these fertile river valleys. They brought down with them silt. And this massive amount of water and silt made possible agriculture on a vast scale. And that massive agriculture made possible a massive population, which in turn made culture and cities and civilization possible. That, combined with a large population and political order, made possible large armies. Those armies spread out, and they brought that culture with them. And gradually you see a larger India taking shape and a larger China taking shape, I should say. And that's exactly the story of these two countries. They weren't created by any individual. They were created by this plateau, the Tibetan Plateau. And that's why, for so much of human history, you see the same pattern. But what's interesting is that pattern persists today as well. This is a map of population density of China and India. And what you see is that the population is concentrated along these same river valleys, the same ones I just told you about. The Gangetic Plain of India, you can see, dark red. That's because a lot of people live there. In the Yellow River valleys of China, you see the same concentration of population. The exact same concentration that was true so long ago holds true to this very day, and that is the evidence of the account that I've just given you. And that's why, for so much of human history, we see this graph with a dominant blue bar. So that was that first question. But now I want to take you to that second question. China and India were rich for so long. What happened? Well, it turns out I used to work as a research assistant, and I would think a lot about these topics. And one day I came across some data by a British economist named Angus Maddison. And this data was rich. I mean, this man spent much of his life putting together a meticulous account of world history. He was what you might call a quantitative macroeconomic historian. In other words, a guy who thinks about past economies over the course of human history. He put together some great data, and I want to share some of that data with you now. Now, if you blinked, you might think that this graph is the same one I just had up. They look very similar, but I promise it's not a trick. I didn't get lazy and just repaste the graph. This is actually a different graph. And the reason they look so similar is because that blue bar is tall in both of them. In the first graph, you see that blue bar corresponds to China and India's population. They had half the world's population. In the second graph, that blue bar corresponds to the economy. China and India had half the world's economy. So, why are these two graphs so similar? Why are those blue bars so tall in both graphs for so long? And the answer, unsurprisingly, comes back to geography, comes back to that 2.6 billion, and comes back to that Tibetan Plateau. Because you see, for much of human history, what we did as a people was farm. And it turns out that a farmer in any one part of the world is about as productive as a farmer in another part of the world. So in a world where everyone is equally productive as farmers, whoever has the most farmers has the biggest population. Well, China and India had half the world's population, they had half the world's farmers, and therefore they had half the world's economy. It flows very naturally. That's why these two graphs look so similar. But then things changed. The Industrial Revolution came. It came to Europe. And now individuals with technology could do so much more with so much less. They could produce more in Europe than they could in Asia. Those individuals in Europe working in factories simply could make more than a farmer in China or in India. And over time, Europe was able to convert that small population into a very large economic base. And that large economy, that wealth, was converted into power, and that power was then used and brought to bear on Asia. It subdued China and India. If you think about it, Europe is pretty far from China and India, right? There's only water that connects these. Well, there's also some land, but there's a lot of mountains on that land. It makes it tough. So China and India could only be reached really effectively in an effective, cost-effective way through the waters. And so what happened was Europe had to control many of those waters as they expanded outwards. So European states, the Portuguese in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Dutch in the 16th and 17th, the British in the 18th and 19th, they implemented a strategy. They would take the crucial choke points of these waters, the entry points and the exit points of these oceans. They would then take the small islands that are so important to covering these vast territories. And they take the coastal states that rim these big oceans. And the result was that over time, they were able to gain control of the rich trade of Asia, the rich Indian Ocean trade. And with that trade under their control, they could gradually move on to the mainland of China and India. And you know the rest of the story. Eventually, India was colonized, China was subdued, and look how far and how fast these countries fell. Because as you can see, in 1820, they were half the world's economy. But by 1952, they were only about 10% of global GDP. That's it. What a precipitous fall. The US did very well. The US went from nothing in 1820 to a large portion of the world's economy by 1952. And of course, Europe, surprisingly, was able to keep pace with the United States, going from 25 to about 30% of the world in 1952. But then things changed again. Look in 1952. Look how different things are. You see China and India begin to gradually inch upwards. You see the US and Europe gradually begin to fall downwards. And the reason why is the same story that I just told you moments ago. Technology. Except this time, that technology that was so important to Europe and American industrialization spread to Asia. Now Chinese and Indian workers can be almost as productive as European workers. And we return then to that rule of the past. In a world where everyone is equally productive, the country with the largest population has the largest economy. China and India have the world's largest populations, so they're on track to have the world's largest economies. But this brings me to my third topic, because things can still go off the rails. China and India are competing with each other, and in many ways that competition is dangerous. You see, the Tibetan Plateau, the same thing that created both these massive countries, also kept them isolated from each other. I've been to the Tibetan Plateau. I spent my Fulbright in southwestern China investigating exactly how it worked through history. And I found that very little ever happened across that mountainous border. No Chinese army has ever conquered India. No Indian army has ever conquered China. But these two countries are still rivals. They fought a war over that border in 1962. The war was short, it was sharp, no artillery was used, no air force was used, no tanks were used. It was too hard. The technology couldn't work in such rugged terrain. So as men with guns. And while the war was small, the results were disastrous because relations between these two countries were almost forever poisoned. China began to back Pakistan, India got nuclear weapons and blamed China. Neither of these moves made the countries very happy with each other, and the result was horrible competition. Now today, they're still competing, except today geography again explains the patterns of that competition. You see, China and India are growing so fast and they have so many people that they need resources, but they don't have enough. They have to import them from Africa and the Middle East. And those resources come across the waterways of the Indian Ocean. And you can see here the Indian Ocean on the map. You can see why it's so important. But India juts out into those waters. All those resources flow right past India because of its favorable geographic position. And China is nervous. I mean, relations between the two aren't good. They worry that India might somehow do something about those resources. And India worries about China taking actions like building a navy that would threaten the Indian Ocean. So India decides to build a navy as well, and you can see the story, you can see what's happening. An arms race, competition, it's not great, and it's dangerous. But what's worse is that these countries are using the same strategies used by the Europeans many years ago, well, with some modification. Effectively, both countries are circling each other in the Indian Ocean. They're going after the strategic choke points of these waterways. They're going after the strategic islands of these waterways that are so crucial to governing these vast bodies of water. And they're going after the coastal states that rim the Indian Ocean. They're using investments and technology and commercial access, and they're effectively using the same playbook Europeans used a long time ago. The chessboard of Asia is the same. The strategies used by the players are the same. The stakes are as high as they ever were, the very future of Asia. But the players this time are different. So, this is where I'm going to end the talk. And if it's a little bit upsetting and a little bit troubling to end on a somewhat dour note, I'm sorry, but that's world politics. It's not always so easy. It's not always so clean. And sometimes it should be troubling. But having studied all this history, Deng Xiaoping, Nehru, thinking about how these countries came up, I've learned one thing. Geography casts a long and dark shadow, but individuals can step out of that shadow. Geography isn't preordained. Its effects can be changed by inspired leadership. China and India had that inspired leadership before. It's what made them rich again. And with inspired leadership today, these two countries can continue to be economic powerhouses. They can recapture their past wealth. They can bring that prosperity home, and that will be beneficial for all of us. I believe it can happen. Thank you.